Welcome to the discussion series on free trade and liberalization as part of the 1991 project at the Mercatus Center. I am Shruti Rajagopalan, and in this conversation series, I will be talking trade with Professor Arvind Panagariya, who is the director of the Deepak and Meera Raj Center on Indian Economic Policies and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. In the past, he has served as the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog in Government of India and as chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. He is the author of a number of books, but today's conversation will primarily focus around Indian trade policy with some insights from his recent book, Free Trade and Prosperity. We've covered some, very basic insights on what kind of trade models exist, what they inform us about the world and, economic policy more generally, what we can learn in terms of insights for developing countries and how developing countries can prosper. And if at all there are any valid arguments against trade and in favor of protectionist policies. But now I want to zoom in a little bit more on India specifically. I know we've sort of, brought the conversations and talked about some Indian examples, but I really want to dig into Indian trade policy. And I want to start rather at the beginning. So one of the things that I have observed when I read about, the post-colonial period in India. In fact, I would start maybe even pre-independence in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And it was very clear that socialism as an ideology and also socialist planning as an economic policy framework was gaining a lot of momentum and prominence. And, this we can see throughout the Indian nationalist movement. But in particular, the Socialist Congress Socialist Party was brought to sort of prominence in 1934. By 1938, in just a matter of 4 years, the then Congress President Subhash Chandra Bose created the National Planning Committee. And, this was the committee that was tasked with forming an economic plan for India. And, we know now that this committee met so frequently that its secretary, K.T. Shah, produced about 20 volumes of papers. And this was simultaneously also going on with the war effort. A lot of the socialist price controls, quantity controls that were left as a legacy in India, they really started with the scarcity problems in World War II. And those sort of war controls were a new kind of, socialist planning that was taking place in India at the time. And this was really the sort of precursor to the new Indian government under the leadership of Nehru. And to me, it seems like Nehru, along with most of the nationalist leaders in the 40s, conflated British mercantilism with a different economic system, which is free trade and capitalism. And the Indian nationalist movement had always blamed, British rule for the impoverishment of India. This starts with Dadabhai Nauroji talking about the extractive policies of the British. But the conflation that took place in the 1940s in the Indian nationalist movement was that the impoverishment of India was now blamed on British capitalism as opposed to extractive mercantilism. Now, my big question to you is, what were the consequences of this kind of conflation, right? What did it mean for, the economic thinking at the time and the economic policy that was being hatched under a new government, which was in this case led by Nehru, while writing the constitution and while being in transition from a colonial state to an independent one?
Shruti, this is a very good starting point. So let me pick up where you have brought me already. As far as Nehru is concerned, and his own view of Great Britain, in some ways, at least particularly, just around the time that the National Planning Committee is appointed, he actually sees capitalism as the evil, the fundamental evil. And the way he sees even what you are calling the mercantilist policies is a necessary outcome of capitalism. So he really very much, it's not just mercantilism. He associates capitalism with the emergence of imperialism. Says that, capitalism creates these factories, and these factories generate a lot of output. You need market for output. Where are you going to get that? So you get them in the colonies. And then the factories also need raw materials. Where are you going to get raw materials? You need raw materials from the colonies. So he had this very direct kind of association of capitalism with imperialism. And so around this time, certainly Nehru believed that the only way to combat this imperialism was to combat capitalism, and therefore socialism was the way to go. And of course, within the Congress, there was a lot of consensus. Subhash Chandra Bose himself actually was very much aligned to the same view. I mean, Subhash Chandra Bose was very much of a staunch socialist in this respect, and Nehru also so both of them really believed also that industrialization was very important, and so really the mandate actually to the planning committee was to think in terms of how India was going to industrialize, what will be the plan for industrialization. In any case, and you also rightly pointed out that the committee really did a lot of hard work, and at the end, actually, the committee's work ended only abruptly only because Nehru got picked up by the British and put into jail, and then he wanted to complete the final volume of the work, and the British would not let him do that. Anyway, so that's a history. But let's come to, I'll really come to what happens after independence. So the Nehruvian view, and here, before we get to trade policy, we need to lay down a bit of background of the overall domestic economic policy framework.
Yeah.
Because that in a way drives the trade policy as well. As we'll see, if you look at 1950s, there is no active trade policy happening at the time.
Yeah.
But we'll come to that. But first, what was the basic framework? So Nehru's basic framework was that because imperialism necessarily followed from capitalism, and this was done through international trade. So therefore, international trade was itself actually to be kind of kept at a distance, and therefore followed the idea of self-sufficiency. So it was, and he writes that in the Discovery of India, saying that we had no in the context of the self-sufficiency objective, that we don't want to be the victims of imperialism, nor do we want to develop similar tendencies ourselves.
Yeah.
And therefore, while we are not against a trade, but we want to minimize that. So self-sufficiency became a very important centerpiece of the entire policy framework that got adopted. And Melanobis, of course, had started interacting with Nehru beginning in 1940. It was not a continuous kind of interaction because Nehru spent large part of his 1940s in jails prior to independence. But nevertheless, they had begun to understand each other. And so later on, Nehru appointed Melanobis as the statistical advisor to the cabinet. And so then Melanobis came centrally. And so basically, we all academically, we think of the basic planning framework as coming from Melanobis' model, which at some level is correct, but it really is a rationalization of what Nehru thought. I mean, Melanobis was completely aligned to Nehru's view. And so what you see, and he interacted even quite closely with Nehru while he was preparing the plan frame, the draft plan frame as it is not known the document. So, all right, so here where it self-sufficiency is the central, but then there are different ways. Even Nehru knew and Melanobis knew that you can't become self-sufficient overnight.
Yeah.
So they knew that it'll take a little while. So there are multiple paths to achieving self-sufficiency. But the very closely associated big mistake that also happens around this time, which to me, I think continues to haunt us till today. It's not a problem we were able to solve because the hysteresis is so deep. Which was the focus on the heavy industries.
Yeah.
I mean, Nehru felt that, unless we learn how to do heavy industries, so learn to make machines, learn to make steel, we would not be self-sufficient. So for self-sufficiency, it was essential. And he talks about, machines that make machines.
Yeah.
Not just, machines that would make parts of bicycles or automobiles or boilers or air conditioners, what have you, but machines that also will make the machines that make these parts and so forth. So that was the conception. And that, I think, was really practically, I should say, fatal, and showed that success was not going to happen in any near future. For the simple reason that, you started off with very limited capital. It was a poor country, so small GDP. And the savings rate was about 7% around the time second 5-year plan was being written. So savings were very small. And if you are going to put that in making steel and making machines that make machines, that sort of investment, very highly capital intensive, then you knew that, most of the capital will basically get absorbed there. And they saw that, they knew that. And so they said, well, what is going to happen to the consumers? They said, well, consumers will, consumer goods will be produced by this small village industries. At that time, the Gandhian kind of view of, promoting the village industries, cottage industries, household industries, and it's called the hand industries, meaning, that's a labor. They refer to these industries as hand industries in many of the documents contemporarily written during the second plan formulation. So they said, well, consumer goods we leave for the hand industries. And so in a way, you see, that is the setup that's set up. Now you know what is going to happen as a result of this. First of all, the heavy industry is never going to achieve the kind of scale because your capital is limited and you're trying to diversify very rapidly. So it's not that, you are going to go for a big scale. And diversification was not just in terms of product, but also in terms of geographical diversification. So, rather than put a very large scale steel mill, you're going to put up 3 of them so that you can put them in 3 different places. So you don't get scale there. And then you do cottage industry for consumer goods in which you actually got comparative advantage. Well, you can't get scale there.
Yeah.
And then to mobilize resources, the government also used the instrument of printing money. So that, of course, also meant that inflation happened. And the exchange rate. Now, this is the big factor which nobody seems to see or bother with at the time. I think this all reflects the prevailing thinking at the time. So it's not as though there is any disagreements on this. Most people are agreeing and all. And there's a lot of agreement actually on what was being done at the time, including this famous panel of economists, which had 20 economists selected from universities in 8 different states and all. So, eminent economists collected. They were all there, and largely, except B.R. Shenoy making a sort of decent note. And from the Bombay School, C.N. Vakil and B.R. Brahmanand, writing something to the contrary, although still not dissenting formally. But the rest of the panel actually is in agreement and all. So it's not as though what was being done was contested at the time by almost anybody. But the fact of the matter is that if your nominal exchange rate is fixed, inflation is higher, then you know that domestic prices are way more lucrative on everything when the foreign prices are. So exports will suffer, you know that. Also, imports will want to come in because imports are a lot cheaper with the fixed nominal exchange rate and the domestic prices rising. Now, on top of that, what you are doing is you haven't got really serious scale of production, either in the heavy industries or in the consumer light industries. So your costs of production, therefore, are high everywhere. And because the exchange rate is fixed, they are high in rupee terms in almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your competitiveness, so you see this transformation that happens in most developing countries where they become exporters of labor intensive products. Just didn't happen in India. And that is the sort of background to the whole system. But against that background, perhaps we can come to the discussion of how the policy itself, the trade policy itself.
Yeah, and before I get into the mechanics of the trade policy, I would actually highlight 2 or 3 more unintended consequences of going in the direction of heavy industry. So, one of the unintended consequences was to actually have these heavy industries perform and hire from within India, you needed to produce engineers, right? And scientists, engineers, applied work to set up these industries and run these industries, which meant that a lot of the government focus in education went towards higher education, right? And it went towards necessarily setting up IITs and engineering colleges and things like that. And the vision was, this is the modern way to go because it's science at its highest level. But we know that, in a country, a fraction is going to be, engineers, right? So if your education policy is entirely designed as an input for heavy industry, you are in trouble already, right? So you become very good at producing engineers and not very good at producing other kinds of human capital. So I think that was one unintended consequence. The other, partially unintended, partially intended, is because the government is going to invest in heavy industry and they want to acquire a certain kind of scale. When it comes to, what they're calling hand industries or cottage industry, the second fatal blow is the small scale industry reservation list. Right. So this is basically a list of, sectors or industries which are supposed to remain small. They cannot exceed an investment of more than a certain amount of money. And that means that anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur and eventually achieve scale, that is, if you want to be in the garment business and you want to supply garments to Zara across the world or something like that, you are necessarily not going to be doing that in a labor intensive way because you're going to fall in the category of one of those industries, right? Whether it's making shoes or whether it's making handicraft. So there is this really complicated relationship that the government seems to have with scale, right? Where scale is thought of as one of the achievable goals and not as an output of really successful or a really productive enterprise in the first place.
Absolutely. No, I mean, long-term effects really go a lot deeper, so not only what you have just mentioned, but just think of what you said about cottage industries or hand industries. A lot of the low-level skills are developed precisely in these industries. This is where the skill formation begins. Yeah. But once you say there's a hand industries, no capital allowed. Other than the household capital, whatever, get your needles and get your, threads and so forth, but charkha and so, but the industrial skills will simply not be developed if in those industries you don't allow. So on the one hand, you are developing these engineers and very high level technical expertise. On the other, in terms of low-level skills, from which vast population begins to kind of rise up.
Yeah,
that's not happening. So you still see, and the impact today remains. That our workforce is the least skilled workforce today after 75 years of near 75 years of independence. So much deeper. And the impact that this leaves, because you see, there is also this inheritance in terms of thinking. So the socialist thinking doesn't end with Nehru. I mean, it's inherited. And so, all the major actors, politicians, journalists, intellectuals, bureaucracy, in every one of these influential classes of people, socialism has its inheritance. And this is where, there's a book I'm working on right now, where I'm going to bring all this. But this is where democracy and socialism is a sort of a cocktail that is lethal. That's lethal. In contrast, remember that China had more or less the same model, but because it was authoritarian, Deng Xiaoping could come along and tell everybody, okay, old game is over. New game is beginning. In a democracy, that doesn't happen. I mean, even think 1991, when Narasimha Rao begins to kind of make changes, he never says that I'm changing. He says, no, it's a continuation. I mean, if you read the speech by Manmohan Singh, in some ways it's a fantastic speech. But in other ways, he's also, saying we are connected to what Rajiv Gandhi did. We are connected to what Nehru did. So there is that connection drawn, because in democracy, that's how you have to move very slowly, gradually and all. And even, you see, the way this ideology left the impact comes along 2009 to 14, right? UPA 2. Socialist policies reassert themselves, right? Right to Education Act, very much a socialist act. And the Land Acquisition Act, very much a socialist act. You see, and remember who is running the finance ministry around this time. You got Pranab Mukherjee, pretty much a committed socialist. So the impact of what Nehru did remains still a long time through all these inheritances that happened. I mean, it's like you inherit ethics from your family. but the new IAS officers who come in learn from the senior ones that are in existence, and so they then take their mantle and carry the work forward. And so this, you can see it till today. Journalists, intellectuals, bureaucrats, politicians, still kind of, So the damage, long-term damage is significantly wider and deeper and long-lasting.
In one sense, self-sufficiency, as you discussed, is going in the direction of heavy industry, homegrown, home-cultivated heavy industry. But another way that self-sufficiency eventually emerges in India is some kind of, autarkic trade model. But before we get to the later years of autarky, can you tell us a little bit about sort of, the domestic trade policy in the 40s and 50s at this point? What was being thought through? What were the models being used? What were the ideas being debated?
So, that's a good way to begin the discussion on trade policy. As originally, of course, the British had imposed on India free trade policy. Meaning that goods in India could enter without any custom duties, and whatever little custom duties that got imposed were like to raise revenues. So, there'll be 2.5%, 5%, something like that. It's only in a real sense what we would call the protective trade policy. Which is different from the revenue raising. Revenue is a different because you can't, at that time internal commodity taxation is harder. So at the border it is easier to collect taxes. So for revenue purposes you do that. So that little bit of that was perhaps done earlier, but really it's in the 1920s that at the lobbying by the Indian industry, some bit of tariffs got introduced in the 1920s. These were in iron and steel and textile. Those were the two kind of major industries that had evolved in India, and other than jute, textiles, of course, also. But so some custom duties got introduced that remained in place, that were inherited. Then came the war. So during the Second World War is when you began to put in place the control kind of system. And initially, kind of, in 1940s, you started with some import controls on the consumer goods. This was as early as 1940. Then by 1942, this was extended to practically all goods. So you put in these import controls, meaning licensing on imports. But there was no specific quantities that were fixed up for these. You just needed a license, which could be given to you if foreign exchange was available and so forth. During this period also, they begin to evolve the principle of essentiality. Now, later it plays very important role, of course, in the entire import policy regime, as we will see. But the principle of essentiality is evolved during this period, although imports from Sterling area were regulated mainly because of the shipping restrictions, because anything that had to do with war had priority in terms of the usage of availability of shipping capacity. So subject to shipping capacity availability, I think still products were allowed to be traded, imported, and exported. So that's a rough kind of regime that we inherit after independence. Towards the end, of the British era, 1945, 1946, the idea of open general licensing had been evolved already also. This also later on in the 1980s it plays a very important role in India's liberalization, early liberalization prior to the 91 liberalization. So we got, so basic machinery, as you see, the import licensing, the principle of essentiality, open general licensing. This is all already kind of evolved from the British period before we became independent. And some expansion of the open general licensing list was done in 1948. But at the same time, this was a period we had a very hyperactive Joint Secretary in Finance Ministry, B.K. Nehru. He was very worried about the foreign exchange and all. So temporarily he had introduced the foreign exchange budgeting. But then B.K. Nehru got transferred to become the executive director of India at the International Monetary Fund. So the minister then issued an order saying abolishing the budgeting. I mentioned this, this historical fact, which is quite important, because later on B.K. Nehru returns, and so does foreign exchange budgeting during his period. And once again, it's his initiative that, of course, introduces the foreign exchange budgeting. So we'll come to that. But this is the very early history. Now, the first planning period, 1950s, that is generally a liberal period, as licensing existed, but licenses were issued with relative ease, and two major categories of licenses were one was the established importer, and the other was the actual user licenses. All these things continue, and become very, very important later on as the licensing regime tightens up later on. So now what happens is that in the 1950s, because of India's war effort, India had earned a lot of sterling balances from Great Britain. Now, there were some restrictions on how much you could draw these sterling balances every year. So the British will not release the entire pot of the sterling balances at once, but every year they will release them. That fact, plus the fact that during the 1950s, the food situation luckily remained pretty reasonable, and we didn't have to import food on a large scale. Some imports had happened, but largely we were able to meet our needs during the 1950s. So both of those factors left sufficient amount of foreign exchange to allow relatively freely imports. So import license. So even during this is a period during which you see that consumer goods imports are also coming in. And according to the third 5-year plan gives the data, at least the aggregate data. So it says during first 5-year plan, about 32% of total imports were consumer goods. So they declined from 32 to 23% in the second plan. But by the end of the second plan, of course, the trade regime really gets very much tighter, and the share of the consumer goods and therefore the share of the established license holders declines very dramatically to 10% or below. So that is the kind of history. Now, what changes? What changes the regime? Why does it become so restrictive, as we will discuss? I think we will come to discuss in great detail. I think for particularly the younger generation, it is good to follow how Kafkaesque or Orwellian this trade regime was in those years. So we can come to discuss that in detail. But very quickly, the origins of it. How did we end up with this kind of system? So what happened is that sterling balances were gradually being depleted. And you knew that this was a fixed pot ultimately, which the British were releasing in different tranches every year, but they were going to run out. Now, it also happens that B.K. Nehru returns in 1954, and he's very upset that this foreign exchange budget is gone. And he also writes these memos to the secretary at the time that, look, and the minister, C.D. Deshmukh, that, look, there is a problem here. He gets no replies. So this is all from his autobiography, So he gets no replies. Eventually, C.D. Deshmukh resigns. T.T. Krishnamachari becomes the finance minister. And he promotes B.K. Nehru to become the secretary of Department of Economic Affairs. And around 1957-58, that's the year in which B.K. Nehru is alarmed that sterling balances. And if we look at the numbers, actually, you can see that in 1957, the foreign exchange reserve really declines quite dramatically. And that scares him as to what's to come. And so he quickly, on his own authority, as the Secretary DEA, issues the order for the return of foreign exchange budgeting. Now, foreign exchange budgeting is nothing but the foreign exchange control. It simply says that, well, anybody who needs foreign exchange now, any transaction that will require foreign exchange, they have to get the clearance of some authority, which to begin with was, of course, no other than Mr. B.K. Nehru. So he would begin to draw up this foreign exchange budget every 6 months. And that, of course, then we see that a whole kind of bureaucratic system has to be evolved, because there are lots of claimants of foreign exchange, and how are you going to allocate them? How are you going to give them? Also, this obviously also begins to lead to the tightening of the import licensing regime as well. And so we can sort of come to that. And the one thing I want to say here, very, very important, is that it was very unfortunate at this time. There was no discussion. What were the possible solutions? If some discussion had happened, and if they had even considered the possibility of devaluation, at this time, economy was doing well. It was not, like growing 7, 8, 9% or anything, but it was decent. 4% growth had been achieved, which was decent for the time. And food situation was generally comfortable. So inflation was not so completely out of hand. So generally, it was good economic conditions. If a proper devaluation had been done, we would have seen some response, some favorable response. Manmohan Singh later, actually, when he writes his thesis in 1964, that famous book, India's Exports, he actually there at the time does say that, what we should do is
Yeah.
to devalue. But you see, then the devaluation happens in June 66 when economic conditions are totally different. There have been back to droughts happen, and so politically, so it doesn't generate the kind of response that was required. But 57, 58, if they had devalued, history could have been a little different. Not dramatically different, I should say, because still business of being in heavy industry, being and consumer goods being done in cottage or hand industries, that would have continued to haunt us nevertheless, but still things could have been a little better.
I completely agree with you. In fact, I wanted to delve into this 1958 as one of the, important structural points in Indian economic history. In one sense, this is sort of the first post-independence balance of payments crisis that India is facing. Yeah. So almost on the brink. So, that's part one. But I think what is the really important lesson? I mean, one, of course, I completely agree with you that, in 1966, the economic situation was worse and also the egos were quite different. T.T. Krishnamachari just simply did not get along well with the American administration at the time. And that led to, there was a lot of personal conflict involved in that devaluation not succeeding, other than the economic problems at hand. In fact, we have a lovely timeline of what happened during the 1966 devaluation and why it failed in our 1991 project website. But in 1958, had we devalued, none of the control systems, whether it is talking about foreign exchange controls or talking about the later industrial licensing controls, which are a natural consequence of an autarkic system, none of that would have happened, and therefore none of that would have had to be rolled back either. In a sense, the 1958 devaluation, had it happened, would have been a rather clean and simple affair, right? It's not having to roll out this massive, as you mentioned, Kafkaesque system of controls, and then having to roll all of it back as we started doing in 1991, and in some sense, we've still not managed to do. It would have been a shift in priorities. So what happens in 1958, given that we don't devalue? One consequence is that the trade policies or trade priorities dramatically shift. Right? And because the trade policy dramatically shifts, there is also a major shift in what is domestic production and consumption policy. Can you walk us through this? Like what are these trade priorities and what are the adverse impacts that follow? You already hinted that, there were outside economists like Bhagwati and Desai who eventually criticized the system that followed, and, even C.N. Vakil and Brahmananda. But what is the system conceptually post 58?
Okay, so we come to that, but just 58 itself, as I said, probably dramatic changes would not have happened as a result because of the domestic regime being what it was, unless But having said that, just imagine, suppose the rupee was devalued significantly. I think it would have required significant devaluation. Yeah. If it was done, some export response would have happened. There is no doubt. It would have happened because economy generally was otherwise on the upswing. So you would have got some export response. That would have changed the minds a bit. So what I'm saying is that one-time devaluation probably would not have been enough to escape the kind of regime that eventually came to rule on import protection. But if it would have also led to a more favorable view in the administration, in the government, of devaluation, that yes, devaluation is an instrument that can deliver exports and therefore solve our foreign exchange problem, then I think, a second time around, we would not have had the kind of episode you're describing happened in 1966, that, all the egos, etc., that come in because egos are building on some, fears that everybody else is expressing also, that, devaluation will be more inflationary, and it's, that whole elasticity pessimism that prevailed and all. So it became bit, the failure of the successive devaluation became self-fulfilling, and that put God's fear in us to devalue in the future, right? For a long time till we come to 1980s, 750 per dollar exchange rate remains. And remember that in this intervening periods, these very high rates of inflation that we suffered from, that of course continued to make the domestic products less and less competitive. And so the exports continue to do poorly. So it is more the psychological impact, I think, which might have helped if devaluation had been tried in 1958. Yeah. So anyway, so that doesn't, that's not what happens at the end of the day. It's just one secretary's decision. And nobody, suppose it seems, you can't find very much discussion of this anywhere except in, at least I haven't found it, except in B.K. Nehru's autobiography. He does that, and that's that. And that, of course, then now begins to build this entire control regime. Now, remember that already investment licensing was, of course, being done. But 50s, you see, the 1950s, even investment licensing is relatively liberal because you don't, your foreign exchange situation is comfortable because the sterling balances. So machinery, etc., that needs to be imported can be imported, and so it is not a big issue. So licenses were being issued. Only thing was that it was understood by the businessmen and the industry in Bombay that consumer goods industry licenses will not be issued. There is no point even in applying. Yeah. So usually they knew the chemical industry, engineering industry, you will get the license, and so you don't hear much complaints about the licensing system not working or being clogged and so forth. That only starts in the 1960s, early to mid 1960s, and then a number of committees get appointed and all. But so what we can do here? So by the way, also. The 1980s, 1950s, nobody is paying attention to exports. So that we will discuss later on when we come to the export policy. But basic point to note here currently at the present moment is that because sterling balances have run out, because exports are not doing well, and nobody is paying attention, there is practically, it's a policy of benign neglect on the export front. And we also suffer, right? In an obscure place, Vakil and Ramanan say this. They say that, look, don't let go of these consumer goods industries in which we have actually developed expertise over 4 to 5 decades. We have the expertise, and they could serve as export industries. So they, in fact, make that pitch in their paper, which was submitted to the Planning Commission as a part of the panel of economists discussions, but I don't think anybody paid attention to it. But they said that, look, but if you look at the industrial structure, how it evolved, then apparently you see this, that like cotton textiles, there is hardly any expansion that happens. Between the 1955, 56, and 60, 61 5-year period, the index of cotton textiles production rises from 128 to 133. Not, it's just a less than 4% increase. Compared to that, if you look at the general industrial index, that rose from 139 to 194. So that's about almost 40% increase. So so it's the industries that are expanding, being allowed to expand, are things like iron and steel, machinery, chemicals. These are the industries that are flourishing by the standards of the day. But cotton textiles, it's not allowed to expand, and this is where we have the advantage. They could turn into export industries, revenues would have been coming, but no, it was not allowed, and it's a pity in a way, because India had a very large share, 10 to 11% in exports of cotton textiles around this time in the 1950s. That advantage is allowed to wither away. And then alternative industries, they try to get engineering goods and chemicals to become exporters. Some exports emerge, but these are small. That's also begins to happen in 1960s, not in the 50s. So 50s, our big exports are like jute textiles, tea, what you'll call primary products. And at that time, we are actually, either imposing export restrictions, meaning quantitative restrictions, no more than this, or we are even taxing. In some cases, export taxes are being levied. So there is no, desire. It is also skepticism that, trying to export more of it will result in decline in prices. Also shared by the economists, this elasticity pessimism that existed at the time and all. So on the one hand, you let, where elasticity was high, both price elasticity as well as the income elasticity was high, which is cotton textiles. There we let it kind of decline for totally wrong reasons, meaning, we are trying to do only heavy industry. So the capital has to be saved for the heavy industries. So cotton textile gets neglected. And where we were exporting, rather than still try to develop those industries, we let them decline also through these controls on exports and export taxes. So overall situation of the foreign exchange is bad, and that's why the crisis and so forth. So now, of course, the import policy, how it looks, right?
Before the import policy, to me, it seems like whatever we see later, at an economy-wide scale in India, which is the problem of command and control policies, we see it as a microcosm with foreign exchange budgeting under B.K. Nehru, right? The same kind of adverse consequences. So what you basically have is you have a bureaucrat who's in control of all the resources. And it's the job of the bureaucrat to pick winners and losers, as opposed to the market, the discipline of a competitive market picking winners and losers. And the bureaucrat has already decided that the winner is heavy industry, right? And it's not going to be some of the consumer goods like garments and textiles that you were talking about. And now you almost have a self-fulfilling prophecy, because all the capital is only going to go to heavy industry. You further have a situation where all these consumer good manufacturers no longer get the kind of investment they need, and they're going to be less competitive, which means they're going to export less, which means you're going to earn less foreign exchange, which means that the demands of the bureaucrat who's controlling foreign exchange in the first place become worse. And now you do this over 3 or 4 or 5 cycles, and you end up in a very dire situation by, let's say the mid 1960s. Is that a good way of thinking about what happened post foreign exchange budgeting?
No, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting. There is a quote somewhere in B.K. Nehru's autobiography. Because you mentioned the fact of the bureaucrat making the decision. At that time, he was a junior. The first time when he did this in 1948, I think. He doesn't mention the date exactly, so one has to guess a little bit. But from reading in between lines, probably was around 1948 or maybe 47. So he was the junior most joint secretary in the ministry. and he issues the order that henceforth, and then very triumphantly writes, in his autobiography, saying that now, every ministry had to come to the junior most joint secretary, Mr. B.K. Nehru, to get the clearance. And Mr. B.K. Nehru had the power to now cut anybody's foreign exchange demands to whatever he thought was appropriate. But that of course, as I said, was gutted after he returned back to the. He went to IMF as executive director, but then when he came back, so it came back. But it was very much of a bureaucratic decision. It was very much of a bureaucratic decision.
So as you say, India has, in a sense, doubled down on its heavy industry policy. It has doubled down on, disincentivizing small industries or, hand industries and so on and so forth. But it has also doubled down on the role of the the bureaucrat as the center for, or, sort of as the coordinating node for all economic activity in the country, right? So these three things, these were bets that were made by Nehru in the late 40s, and by the late 50s, we've doubled down on all three bets, even though, at the end of the second plan, there is some minor criticism about what's happening. Now, how does this play out exactly in terms of, the import and export system? And in particular, I want to talk about the controls and tariff system. From what I understand, tariffs, even at this point in time, played a fairly small part in India's trade policy. India's trade policy was really about import and export controls at that time. So can you walk us through this? Because this is an area not too many people are familiar with. And it's a little bit extraordinary once we hear about just how deep the control system went. There's nothing like this that exists in India today, even though we're still a relatively, restrictive trade regime. But this is just something that you read in sci-fi novels or something like that.
Yeah, so I think, even though it's a bit tedious discussion, I think we ought to look at it in some detail, because, today there are very often casual kind of remarks get made that, oh, we are returning to 1970s. No, we are not returning to 1970s, because anybody who makes that remarks just doesn't know what 1970s and 60s were. I mean, so it is worthwhile from that perspective to flesh it out a bit.
Yeah.
So as you said, tariffs, yes, tariffs were not used as the protective instrument. No, they were used in a serious way, as revenue instruments. Because either way, you would have actually, tried to take out all the quota rents that got created. Licenses created a lot of premium on, the imported products. They did not, So on average, tariffs, the highest tariff around, this is 1965, 66, we have the data from Bhagwati and Desai. Consumer goods were the highest, which is 100%. But anyway, that didn't matter much because licenses were so tough to get for consumer goods. Basically, by 65, 66, except for rare commodities, you would not get, so these were not even permissible commodities. They were permissible commodities and they were non-permissible commodities, and consumer goods largely were non-permissible. Plant and machinery, 35%, agricultural machinery, 15%, basic industrial raw material, 40%. So, they were not particularly high. Collection-wise also, if you look at, 62, 63, you were import revenues, tariff revenues as a percent of the dutiable goods. So it's not even as a percentage of all imports, but only goods that were subject to positive duty, 25 or 26% in 62, 63. It rises steadily to about 55% by 65, 66. But this is really nothing compared to what we would call the import premium. Now, I'll give you some examples. You'll have a good laugh at some of these numbers. So on some consumer goods, for example, Bhagwati and Desai, really very good documentation, by the way. Anybody who's interested should really read that book. It's a hard book to read, but it's absolutely a gold mine of information on entire Indian system. I mean, it's not just trade policy. Trade policy is fleshed out in detail also, but also industrial policy, politics, private versus public sector, everything. It's a fantastic book. Anybody interested in that part of the history really should read that book. Absolute landmark. So here, some numbers. Pens. Pens were generally not allowed to be imported. So it was very difficult. So they provide for three different kinds of pens. There's Goldwig, Waverly, and Hindu. HINDOO. So on Goldwing, so this is the premium over the world price. So border price, CIF delivered price. So what you're looking at is what is the domestic price minus the CIF price from imported as a percentage of the CIF price. So how by what percent the domestic price exceeds the CIF import price.
Yeah.
For Goldwing, 380%. For Waverly, 291%. So, there are pencils, right? I mean, you think lead pencils. So Taj Mahal lead pencil was the desired commodity in those days because the premium on that was 602%.
602.
You got, writing paper. So there is some Conqueror writing paper, 610% premium on it. So it's really,
Wow.
and these are the more kind of final products. But then there are also on intermediate inputs.
Intermediate.
Yeah, massive, so the engineering goods like shock absorbers for Jeep. So in fact, in this case, the numbers are giving you the percentage by which the domestic price exceeded the tariff inclusive price. Okay, so in this case, tariff inclusive, so even that's taken out. And on top of the tariff, this is the amount of profit you can make, proportionate tariff you can make if you got the license. Yeah. So shock absorbers for Jeep, 146%. This is 1962. Shock absorbers, Landmaster, 150%. So, this is incredibly high premiums that are there. And that's because tariff policy is not what is determining what your domestic price is. It is the import restriction, which is so tight, and the demand and the need for it is so intense that people are willing to pay that kind of price.
Yeah, so one of the things is also paper in your list, right? It's if I can find printing paper Solex, which is the amount, the premium is 265, and it reminds me of the anecdote you told me about Bhagwati writing to his friends abroad.
That's true. It is a good one. Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us that anecdote again.
Yeah. So obviously, this paper being so expensive, everybody would use the Indian paper, right?
Yeah.
So Bhagwati sort of came from Cambridge, where and was very nationalist at the time. The whole family was, I think apparently one of his brothers was also participant in the underground movement and all at the time. So he, to his teacher Harry Johnson, who is a trade economist and of great repute, actually. He died relatively young, somewhere around 76, 77. So he would have certainly been, probably Jagdish and Johnson would have been jointly awarded a Nobel Prize if he had been alive. But anyway, so Jagdish wrote to him saying that, dear Harry, I find it so repulsive or something, not quite those words, but that it's really disappointing that there is such a craze for foreign goods in India. So Harry, being also a very quick wit, wrote back saying that, dear Jagdish, if I go by the quality of the paper on which your letter was written, the craze for the foreign goods seems quite justified to me.
And, just to connect it back to some of the previous, discussions we've had in the last 3 episodes, this is classic, right? There is this huge premium for imported goods, which means there's this huge demand. And you have this huge demand because you want to make sure that the goods are not imported and some domestic substitute is used. But because there is such a big premium, the domestic competitors don't have to really compete, which means that their product quality ends up being relatively low. They're not competing with the best paper abroad or the best, pens abroad or any of the, shock absorbers, any of the examples that you gave. And that bears out perfectly in this, lovely anecdote of letters between 2 trade economists, which is everything we've learned about trade. It's in this one table in Bhagwati and Desai, right? There is this premium on paper, and now this is where we're going. But
and you'll see, as we go, obviously, when you say that, they're not competing with the best in the world, they don't need to, because it doesn't matter that the way the import regime is going to evolve now, or has evolved by mid 1960s. is that if anything is produced at home,
yeah,
whatever the quality of it doesn't matter, whatever the price at which you are going to get it doesn't matter,
yeah,
protection will be provided. Imports will automatically, if you say that I'm going to produce something, imports will not be permitted anyway of it. So they didn't have to compete. Absolutely.
yeah.
So anyway, so what we can do is for the listeners, try to walk through what exactly this import system looked like. Yeah. So all right. Now here there are two parallel bureaucracies at work. One bureaucracy has to take care of the foreign exchange issue, right? That how the foreign exchange is going to be allocated. So there has to be a bureaucracy to do that. In parallel, there is another bureaucracy which has to make decisions on what goods will be allowed to be imported.
Yeah.
And so import licensing authority. So there is an import licensing bureaucracy and there is a foreign exchange bureaucracy. And at some point, of course, the two have to come together.
Yeah.
But what the two bureaucracies mean is that your first job, if you want to import something, your first job is to get an import license, and then you have to get the foreign exchange.
Yeah.
So getting the import license is necessary, but not a sufficient condition that you'll be eventually able to import, or when you will be able to import. So ultimately, foreign exchange will have to become available as well.
Yeah.
So you may have to wait a little longer. So that's the first broad point, that there are these two bureaucracies with which you have to deal. So first of all, there were three main kind of authorities that had the power to issue licenses. These were not overlapping. These were chartered. These were farmed out. So most of the licenses were issued by the Chief Controller of Imports and Exports. So there was a Chief Controller of Imports and Exports who issued most of the licenses, most of the import licenses, except the ones that are issued by the other two authorities. So who were the two other authorities? The Iron and Steel Controller. So you can see heavy industry and steel, Nehru's very kind of favorite industry. That was always supreme. So you had a separate Iron and Steel Controller. So any licenses that had to do with the imports of iron and steel Controller would issue those licenses. So you have to deal with that. Then there was a third one, which is the Development Officer Tools. So this is where some technical stuff goes on within the development wing of the Ministry of Commerce.
Yeah.
So anything that had to do with technical stuff, then the development officer, and so what licenses that authority, the development officer in Commerce Ministry issued, was also stated that this is their territory. Right. So that was the division. So most of the licenses, therefore, were issued by the Chief Controller of Imports and Exports, and known by the acronym CCI&E. I mean, in those days, you never use the full form, Chief Controller or something. You just say CCI&E. Okay. Now, what were the import licenses themselves were like? So there is a whole classification of different import licenses. And these are terms we have already discussed earlier. So there were the established importers. These were the importers who could import and then sell it to others. As opposed to the next category, which was actual users. So actual users license were issued only to the actual users, as it's what it says. So these are largely for raw material and intermediate inputs. So all the inputs that have to be imported would be go as actual users. and then there is established importers. Then they had a separate category called capital goods. So any capital goods to be imported, which were also usually issued only to the actual users, no established importer will get a license for that. So that was another very important category. So if you're starting a new enterprise, so, and obviously there is an interface there with the industrial licensing authority, ultimately, because the industrial licensing authority will not give you the industrial license unless you had the clearance first from the capital goods committee of the CCI and E. So, so that's how it worked. For the industrial licensing was connected also to this import licensing. You know, it's not just the import licensing and a foreign exchange authority, but also there's a link to the industrial licenses. Then there were some others, like, you know, heavy electrical plant had a separate category for itself. These are, you know, electricity generation plants, if you are going to bring in. And there were license for newcomers, established versus newcomers. So I don't think there were many in those days, you know. But if somebody found a way, you know, some connection or what have you, then under newcomers, you would be also, there's a newcomers license. Then there was some export promotion. This was also done, particularly in the 60s, they had started off. So there was some export promotion licenses as well. And then there were some miscellaneous categories and all. But really the main ones is actual user for inputs and capital goods for capital machinery. So those were the licenses to be issued. Now, how the system worked was that, you know, what we can do, basically, the Bhagwati and Desai kind of give the illustration that if you look at, you know, how the actual user licenses were issued for these inputs. That's the illustration they gave you. So first, the importer had to meet two basic conditions. So if you're an importer, first thing you need to do is get clearances for two conditions. One is essentiality, that we have already seen before, that was introduced in the Second World War, but now it becomes very critical. Now the implication of essentiality condition is simply that, you know, that it gives bureaucrats some power, right? You know, if the bureaucrat decides that this is not an essential import for whatever reason, then you're done for. So it does give you. Then the second condition that had to be offered, even if it was essential, it was also had to be something that was domestically not available. So there was a domestic non-availability condition. And that condition was regardless of cost or quality. It doesn't matter how much it is going to cost to get from domestic source. It doesn't matter what quality product you are going to get. So much so that I remember, you know, and Kruger has this example one time, you know, for India's tea exports were suffering to Germany, and they were suffering, they were losing out to the competitors because the, you know, tea bags, they had to use local paper. They had to use local paper. And that quality of the paper was so poor that their exports were getting rejected. But the government of India would not allow because they were domestically available. So you failed the condition of domestic non-availability. So anybody who comes in and says, yeah, I can provide it. Doesn't matter how good or how bad, you know, the quality didn't matter, price didn't matter. So you could easily also be driven. I mean, so for both reasons, you could be driven out of your export markets, right? You know, if the quality is poor, you will get driven out. If if the cost is very high domestically, then also you will be driven out. But that was a condition. So then who was the authority to give these certifications? So that's where there is a sponsoring agency that comes into play. You had to have some, so they will be designated for different sector imports. There will be different ministries, you know, or different directorates who would be authorized to be the sponsoring agencies, who would normally give the essentiality certification. And many times this sponsoring authority will also give the domestic non-availability certification, although the two agencies were not always the same. You know, for sometimes your essentiality certification may be from one authority, and your non-availability may come from another authority. But these are designated, so you have to go and get those. Now, actual user licenses for input imports, how did it work? So now the CCI and E, there is, these are divided. Actual user licenses themselves then get divided into several groups.
Yeah.
Okay? So, for example, they get divided into small scale sector. So there is some licenses which are in the small scale sector, actual user. Then there is second, which is organized sector scheduled industries that are assigned to the Directorate General of Technical Development in the Ministry of Commerce. So there were some industries for, so there is small scale sector, then the large scale sector is divided into two. One is the set of industries, and these are more kind of technically sophisticated industries, for which you have the Directorate, organized sector scheduled industries assigned to the Directorate General of Technical Development. And then you got the other organized sector scheduled industries, or whatever you call the other large scale industries, right? So small and then large divided into these two. So the Directorate General of Technical Development certified the importer for both essentiality and domestic non-availability condition for industries that were assigned to that. So that directorate was assigned a number of industries, and they would give both the essentiality certification and non-availability certification. For small scale, there were the state directors of industries who gave the same clearances for small scale importers, entrepreneurs. And then for remaining scheduled industries, there were a number of different agencies, depending on the type of import, right? So you had there was a Central Silk Board that will certify the essentiality and non-availability for the silk industry. There was Coal Commissioner who would do it for collieries. There was Textile Commissioner who would do for textiles. So like that. So there were these different designated agencies.
But this is a natural consequence of what the original problem, right? So if you don't have a tariff system and you instead opt for a control system, as part of your trade policy, then, you say, okay, now we need some kind of rational mechanism by which we can allocate, right? Which is not the market rational mechanism. We need to substitute it with something. And then they come up with this essentiality and non-availability. But both essentiality and non-availability completely depend on the sector in question, right? And now you've created a situation where you need about 7 different bureaucracies, the ones that you've mentioned, because a random person sitting in Commerce Ministry may not know much about silk or textile or tea or, the DGTD, which, was for, chemical fertilizer or something like that, which means now you need to house these new bureaucracies. You need to hire chemical engineers who will become engineers turned bureaucrat, who then have to go through a particular protocol and say this is essential or not, or this can be produced at home or not. So the whole system in a way creates itself, right? It's not like someone messed up and made a hack job of it. It's, if you start with import controls, this is the only logical place you will end up, and there's nowhere else to go, really. In fact, I'm surprised it was this limited. I would have imagined even further proliferation, which probably happens, would have happened if we had gone past.
Don't underestimate here, by the list here, because list is partial, right? Because all the ministries will chip in, and later on, as it evolves, there were groups of ministers created. And by the way, I don't think they're hiring engineers to do this, except maybe in DGTD. Maybe there was some, but largely these are operations run by the IAS bureaucrats. Because remember that there are big rents associated with these decisions. There are big rents associated, so we are at every single point you are
Yeah.
creating rents and therefore potential for bribes.
Yeah.
And this is why also the movement of files, right? That file begins with the lowest level officer within any ministry.
Yeah.
For anything. So the essentiality or non-availability and all, file will start at the bottom. And until you put some weight on the file, you have to put some weight on the file before it moves.
Absolutely.
Meaning, so you have to bribe the fellow. You have to bribe the fellow to often, so.
And, I remember T.N. Srinivasan had said somewhere that you have all these different controls, right? You have capital controls and you have import controls, you have, industrial licensing controls and price and quantity controls. And then he said, all the controls taken together were far more restrictive than each of them individually, right? So for instance, if you get the industrial license, it doesn't automatically imply that you have a capital goods import license. Then you have to go and stand in front of a different bureaucracy altogether. And it's only when you get all the licenses can you even start. That's the starting point for production for a domestic entrepreneur. Right. So there is something really quite crazy going on in the way the Indian economy started running, starting in the 60s and then goes on for a fair bit.
Yeah, not only multiple points, but they also interact, you see, because
they interact.
Once foreign exchange became limited, then if you needed a machinery, for example, previously in the 1950s, it was enough to give the broad category within which the machinery import would fall, meaning broad category of the industrial classification.
Yeah.
But now, once this happened, you have to give a very detailed description of the machinery, of your raw materials, everything. There had to be a very specific, very detailed description. Because it had to be then assessed by the essentiality authority.
Exactly.
That otherwise it's how do you even assess? So you have to give very detailed specifications. So even that sort of thing, crept in. So yes, the sum of the restrictions actually amount to a hell of a lot more than the individual restrictions taken in isolation. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now this licensing, this is just the import licensing part of the story, right? But there is also an entire system of controls related to foreign exchange, for instance.
Yeah. Right. So then there is a separate bureaucracy that runs on how the foreign exchange is to be allocated. So that starts with there was eventually they created by 1965. It existed already. It started at the top with the foreign exchange budget branch in the DEA, Department of Economic Affairs and Finance Ministry. So they had a whole separate foreign exchange budget branch. And so what they would do is first they will estimate what the foreign exchange availability from exports and other sources is going to be over the next 6 months or a year. So there were periods, when they were doing, so there used to be something called the Red Book that came out of the Commerce Ministry every 6 months or sometimes every year. And the Red Book spelled out in great detail, what is allowed, what's disallowed, what is permissible, what's not permissible, in what quantity, from where. It is an incredible documentation, So that's how it started there. So what happened then? First, what they would do is there were some priority items which they would take out at the source within the finance ministry itself. So any debt service charges, debt payment, any interest and principal that had to be paid back on India's foreign debt, that was deducted first. Embassy expenditures got deducted first. Anything that's related to food, fertilizer, and petroleum, oil, and lubricants, POL. Defense expenditures, that also got taken out. So all this taken out, then what is left over is what is available for the allocation to other importers. So now we come to the foreign exchange. which is now to be divided. So we start with three categories here, which is at the level of the finance ministry, the DEA, this so-called foreign exchange budget branch of the DEA. So there will be one allocation, or well, number of allocations for public sector undertakings.
Yeah.
Right. So what would happen is that the ministry itself, finance ministry itself, DEA, would allocate each public sector undertaking certain amount of foreign exchange, both for inputs and for capital imports. So these are for public sector undertakings or public sector enterprises, and it will then assign that foreign exchange to the ministry that is relevant. So, if the particular enterprise belongs to heavy industries, it will go to heavy industries. If it belongs to textile ministry, then it goes to textile ministry, like that. So that's the allocation. Now it's up to the ministry how it, because remember now the allocation problem, both for license as well as for foreign exchange, particularly foreign exchange, is not just at the level of the industry. Then it has to be to the level of the enterprise. Which enterprises are going to get, which enterprises are not going to get. So there is also that allocation which we have to deal with. So now, first off, the public sector enterprises, for them goes to their relevant ministry. Foreign exchange allocation is communicated. Then there is a bulk allocation for inputs and capital goods that went to the iron and steel controller. That is the favored child of the government of the day, and so there is iron and steel controller. So remember that iron and steel controller also issues the licenses. So in this case, the foreign exchange decision as well as licensing decision, and also the essentiality and the non-availability condition issuance. All that is in this iron and steel controller. And the remainder of the foreign exchange was allocated to the economic advisor in the Ministry of Commerce. And largely this was for the private sector enterprises who wanted to import inputs or machinery. And so for the bulk, actually, once you took out the public sector enterprises, you took out iron and steel, the bulk of the remaining foreign exchange now is about for the private sector people. And that authority, that at least the allocation is now sent out to the economic advisor in the Ministry of Commerce. And now it's up to the Ministry of Commerce advisor, economic advisor in the Ministry of Commerce, who has to figure out the allocation across industries first, and then from industries, it has to be figured out to the individual enterprises. So you can see it's not a simple bureaucracy, No. And I'll give you some numbers. You'll find, it's mind-boggling actually once you begin to see what the numbers that are involved here. So each of these entities then got their allocation of foreign exchange. They had to, as I said, divide among the industries and enterprises. Now, how did the economic advisor allocate? Now, economic advisor created a lot of the groups of entities to which it will then allocate the foreign exchange. Right? So there were some groups created by commodities. So examples Bhagwati and Desai gave, like copra and caustic soda. These are like commodity groups. Then there were groups of industries such as bulk allocations to Directorate General of Technical Development. Remember, DGTD is the authority for many organized sector industries to issue the essentiality and non-availability certification. So for that group of industries, the economic advisor, Ministry of Commerce, will make an allocation to the DGTD, the same authority, right? So for a lot of these industries, iron and steel had its own for both licenses as well as foreign exchange allocation. Likewise, DGTD had the jurisdiction over both functions in a large number of industries, particularly the chemical and engineering industries. Then by size of enterprises, the advisor will make another allocation, meaning small scale. So it's for small scale sector, another bulk allocation gets made.
Yeah.
Then there were schemes such as export promotion schemes, under which exporters were given entitlement to import some entitlement to import under some license, under an entitlement license. So for that, there is a separate allocation made. So these different categories are identified by the economic advisor, and there is this allocation done of the bulk allocation that the advisor receives, right? And now it has to be then further at the enterprise level, there has to be separate allocation, right? And the advisor also has to decide about how much to allocate for the input guys, raw materials and intermediate inputs, how much for the capital goods, right? So that allocation has to be done. In most of these cases, there were different administrative agencies such as the DGTD, Textiles Commissioner, etc. involved. And it was not unusual for an enterprise to get foreign exchange from multiple agencies, right?
Yeah.
So if you need steel, then it's the steel, iron and steel controller.
Yeah.
If you need non-ferrous metals, right? If they're non-ferrous metals, you have to go to another agency. If you need capital goods imports, you have to deal with another agency. So any importer in principle could be dealing with multiple
absolutely
sources of foreign exchange. It's not like, well, this is my total need and, this is what, no, you have to have separate applications made for every one of these separate category of imports. So it was really kind of very, very elaborate system. But this is just a process, right? It's just the process. Now comes the question. How do you allocate, right? How do you allocate?
And the question is not just how do you allocate, right? It can't just be any random allocation. It is this allocation rational? And what we mean by that is it the best use of scarce resources, right? Are resources going to their highest valued use within this system the way they would have done in a competitive market process, right? So there is a standard for comparison. So we're not just saying, oh, you have 100 rupees and let's make sure that the different sectors are all happy with like a small share of the 100 rupees. The claim in the socialist system and this autarkic system is that it is an improvement upon the market system, right? And that is something we mustn't forget at the back of our mind, right? So the job is not just, it's not just that it has to be done, that the claim is that it's done better. But, I want to go back to an earlier point that you mentioned, and I have a personal anecdote here, where you said that, at that time, journalists and public intellectuals and everyone was socialist, and there was no real criticism coming from any quarter. And my grandfather and his younger brother, my great uncle, both were journalists. And my great uncle in particular, at that time, for a long time, he was with Hindustan Times and then with the Hindu. He was based in New Delhi. And he's told me so many stories of how like national newspapers, right? So we're talking about Hindustan Times or the Hindu or these really big papers. You have to go and stand in Commerce Ministry or Iron and Steel or any one of the departments that you're talking about to get allocation for a printing machine, right? To get foreign exchange allocation for newsprint. And of course, we know the newsprint orders were used in a particularly, malevolent way by Mrs. Gandhi. And then, it went on to the Bennett Coleman case. And then the Supreme Court said this is an actual infringement. The newsprint order, which is essentially an import allocation policy, right? It's a trade policy question, said that it's an infringement on free speech, in that particular Supreme Court case. But you have a situation where if you need, R.K. Lakshman has written in his biography that if you needed to make a trip abroad as a journalist, you needed to get, your allocation of dollars. And how do you get that? Every single, so when we're thinking about this and, we say iron and steel, or we say paper, or we say coal, our natural tendency is to only think about a particular type of industry. And we're thinking about, like this rich, greedy capitalist standing in front of a really malevolent bureaucrat. But in fact, it seeps into everything, right? It seeps into schools. It seeps into hospitals, it seeps into newspapers. And before you know it, especially in the case of newspapers and schools, you can't have any opposition to the current dispensation and its economic regime, because you are all waiting in line to get your allocation, which can be taken away at any point, by one arbitrary move of someone saying this doesn't fulfill essentiality or something like that.
No, absolutely. It's a perfect system for extracting bribes.
Abuse. Absolutely. Yeah.
Abuse and extracting bribes, And the pity is that the cake is so small. So, bribes that are being extracted are also small. Sometimes all you're doing is to treat the fellow to a cup of tea or something, or samosa maybe. But
yeah.
So, because the incomes are so low. I remember, when we were growing up, we would complain that, such and such, he's an irrigation engineer and he's such a corrupt fellow and all. But then when we grew up, we found out that nobody, became rich taking bribes because ultimately it was a cake was so small. So, if you
and it was more a favor. And, it was more like a favor exchange system, right? So you would, the bribe for the bureaucrat was that the son-in-law will be given a job in the company that, was requesting the foreign exchange or something like that, right? It really became a favor and crony economy, in addition to a corrupt and discretionary economy. It really started enforcing these networks of, you need to know who is who, and that's how you get things done. So, even when you look at all these old 1970s movies, right? Like these Amol Palekar movies and all, it keeps popping up how you can't get a job without sifarish, right? Without someone calling from above, right? So it really became like this favor exchange economy in a really strange, so it has implications even for human capital allocation, right? You mess with this trade and capital control system, and eventually all the downstream effects are that it infects everything. So just, to take this further, in addition to what you said, Bhagwati and Desai, there's, of course, Arun Shoury's excellent work, his doctoral dissertation on this kind of foreign exchange allocation. It's very readable. But what are the economic effects, like beyond this immediate corrupt political economy that has been created for foreign exchange?
Right. So let's come to the effects, but first, just the basic idea to complete our discussion of how difficult the system was, and the whole idea that ultimately, all right, so this was the process, but how was the process implemented? What were the priorities? Precisely how did the bureaucrats decide? So on that, Bhagwati and Desai write this, beautiful sentence. They say that, look, this was the problem was Orwellian. All industries had priority, and how was each sponsoring authority to argue that some industries had more priority than others? So as a result, there was no rational way, and so this is where Arun Shoury's thesis also comes in, because he precisely groups that particular question. How are you deciding the priorities? So even some people tell him that, no, some particular industry which is doing it, or some ministry doing it, say that no, we have the established priorities. We have high, medium, and low priorities. So then, of course, Arun Shoury, being Arun Shoury, goes and further probes that those who are actually doing the allocation, are they using these priorities? Nobody is using. There is no use of the priorities. So Bhagwati and Desai, they will say that, look, it is not surprising that the agencies involved in determining industry-wise allocation fell back on vague notions of fairness, implying pro rata allocations with reference to capacity installed or employment or shares defined by past import allocations and similar other rules of thumb without any clear rationale. Right. So ultimately, when you can't figure out a set of priorities, then the reason you can't figure out the priorities is that the list of industries, and this is where the system gets really hairy, list of industries over which you have to decide priorities is so long. So Bhagwati and Desai actually, in fact, go in just to impress upon the reader how difficult the problem is. They give a list of 123 industries. They have listed every single industry. And then they say that each of these industries is subdivided into another dozen and a half industries. So for one or two, they even give the sub-industries. So just think about it, 123, if each one has another 10, it's 1,230 industries. How are you going to decide who has priority over which? It's just impossible. There's no rational way for a bureaucrat to see the whole picture. And then also see, you know, what the industrial license authority is doing and all. There's no way. It's completely so the Orwellian kind of characterization by Bhagwati and Desai is absolutely very apt characterization. And this is where then they say that, look, you know, ultimately they would say some notion of fairness. You know, they've got this much capacity, so we should allow that. Or they will make these rules that, okay, this particular 6 months or this particular year, foreign exchange is in short supply. So we will give everybody, let's say 60% of their capacity. Well, why everybody 60%? They're not all equally productive, or their products are not all equally desirable and so forth. So you know, everybody gets it because that's fair.
Yeah.
So this is how, you know, or well, last year, how much did we allocate? So
that was the typical method.
So you know, you well on that. So it's not being decided based on either efficiency or the desirability of the particular product. You know, where excess capacity is less valuable, where excess capacity is more valuable. None of that is playing. It's basically these decisions. You know, so Shuri, for example, is a very good quote which appears, you know, from his. So you're right. His thesis was written in 1966 at Syracuse University. So this is Arun Shuri, as quoted in Bhagwati and Desai, saying that the extensive interviews with development officers, industrial advisors, the Deputy Director General Engineering, and the Director General revealed that, in fact, no formal and detailed categories of industries between high, medium, and low priorities, nor of the principle on which priorities should be assessed, is in use. A list was compiled by the Deputy Director General in 1962, meaning list with these industries and priorities, but it was never used, and it has never been brought up to date.
Yeah, but one part of it is that it's very complicated and there is no criteria. But the other part of it is, that whole Mises Hayek impossibility of socialist calculation, right? It's not just that it is difficult to do, it's that it simply can't be done. The nature of the problem that they are trying to solve, which is to substitute rational allocation through market forces with a bureaucratic allocation, you're simply not going to be able to calculate your way out of it. Because now you've said that prices and profit and loss are irrelevant to your allocation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right? So and if you have price controls, and you don't allow for profits, and so all that is happening through the industrial licenses and control system and price and quantity controls, which already exist in the market. So once you don't rely on prices and profits, right, what is the rational basis for allocation? I mean, there simply isn't one. So then you have to replace it with something. And in some sense, some of the more honest bureaucrats, they did their best. They poured over the 123 categories and said, a little bit upar niche from last year's allocation seems about fair. So, you're tinkering. And some of the less honest bureaucrats are just going to make something up and give it to the people that they favor. And everyone can now indulge in their biases. But still, the problem, I don't think, is with the people involved. I think the problem is just the system. They place you and me in this system, and all our collective economics knowledge is going to collapse, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. There is no doubt that it couldn't be done. It just couldn't be done. So on that, so when ultimately it got to the firm level, right? I mean, so Panchmukhi, the old trade economist, he had this wonderful study that he got some firm level import data, and then tried to correlate it to profitability. And in many cases, he found the correlation to be negative. It's the guys who are least profitable were managing to get the foreign exchange, and the ones who were profitable were not getting much lower allocation. So,
Yeah.
Which is not surprising. I mean, it could go any way. Maybe there would be no correlation also, but that was how it was. It was basically a problem which could not be solved. So therefore, you had to seek ad hoc solutions. And for the bureaucrat, what is most worrisome is that somebody will raise the question.
Yeah.
And so you have to be there. You have to have your criterion, which is transparent. At least you can answer. So it says, so you say, whatever I did last year is what I did this year. So that is defensible. Apparently, there was, during the China war, they had to, because foreign exchange was required for defense-related imports. So all the regular imports had to be cut. So they did a largely proportionate cut across all industries. I mean, that tells you that they were using the rule of thumb. That's an evidence that Arun Shuri cites, that they were using basically the rules of thumb.
Yeah. And, I have to say, there are two things I've read by Arun Shuri, which I recommend everyone reads. This dissertation, the one he wrote in 1966, and a later book that he wrote called Governance, which is about
I've read that
his
book.
experience as a disinvestment minister. The lovely thing about Shourie is he does exactly what you have been doing in the last hour, right? Like, not just saying we had this import control policy or something, but actually walking through the details and weeds of who were the people involved, who were the bureaucrats involved, how did a file move from here to there? And that is when we are really able to put some actual visual to what, Bhagwati and Desai have been calling Orwellian or Kafkaesque. That, really comes to life in a way that it doesn't come to life when we just look at aggregate numbers or productivity numbers or firm numbers, right? Like the movement of this system, like within government, and how it tightly controls everything. I think it's worth knowing more. Arvind, this was absolutely fascinating. I mean, I know this was a tedious job for you to prepare and tell us this kind of detail about how, India dealt with the external sector, foreign exchange allocations, import controls. So many interesting things are coming out of this. And it's sort of almost like a nightmarish view of what was going on within the Indian economy at that time. So I think we will wrap it up here. There is a lot more tedious detail and more scary conversation coming when we talk about exports and many other areas in the external sector. But, hopefully that will lead up to a happy ending like liberalization. But, if you don't mind, we will carry on the conversation about tariffs and exports and continue this next time.
Perfect. Let's do that and we'll meet again.
Thank you so much, Arvind.